Okay, members, the sitting is resumed. It's time now for questions to the Minister of Finance, and I call Robin Newton to ask the first question. Robin Newton.
Number one.
The Cyber Champions programme was launched on the 18th of November 2021 and has been produced in partnership with the Consumer Council, the PSNI and the Scamwise Partnership. The Cyber Champions programme is aimed to protect our young people while they are online by helping them safely navigate cyber risks, and provides a resource pack to assist teachers and leaders of youth clubs and groups to explain key aspects of cyber security in a fun and meaningful way. In empowering and informing our young people about cyber risks and the key behaviours and actions, they will be in a better position to protect themselves, their friends and their family. This initiative also informs young people of the opportunities that exist to explore the ever-growing and fast-paced world of cyber security as a potential career pathway. The Cyber Champions Resource Pack is available on the Cybersecurity Centre's website, and I would strongly encourage young people to avail of this resource and to familiarise themselves as to how they can protect themselves from cyber threats.
Supplementary, Robin Newton.
Mr. Speaker, I agree with the Minister in his words. It's a fast-paced, changing environment. One of the objectives, Minister, is to encourage the sharing of knowledge with peers, family and the wider community, particularly among those who may be more vulnerable to attack. Is there scope within the programme, Minister, of, rather than being confined to just the young person who participates, but in fact to involve the wider family in the programme of training?
Well, the fact that a pack is produced, which I hope is accessible and usable for all young people, is to assist themselves, their peers and their families in relation to knowledge about cybersecurity issues, and I would hope that they do avail of that and they do use it in that way. This programme has really only been launched now very recently, so I'm sure it will take some time to see how it rolls out and the success of that, and if there is identified a need for another cohort of people that perhaps aren't included in this, then I'm sure that can be looked at in the future.
Minister, clearly cybersecurity is a growing and cross-cutting issue. While the Cybersecurity Centre is part of the Department of Finance, can you outline any engagement and cooperation it has with other executive departments?
Well, I think the member is correct in that we do act as a coordination and champion role for cybersecurity across all of the departments, and as part of this role, it's necessary to work with them and get input and drive initiatives forward. Input from other departments helps with achieving a better overall cybersecurity outcome based on the develop, defend and deter themes set out in the strategic framework for action. For example, working with the Skills and Industry Group that provides input from the Department of Justice, PSNI, Department of Education, Department for Economy, Education Authority and CCEA and private sector look at the challenges around cyber skills, shortages and education, and we also work with DOJ and PSNI on cyber protect and prevent measures to better cyber support and prevention to businesses, and with the Department for Communities on outreach and advice with community groups and the third sector.
Thank you, Minister. Minister, it's around the same sort of a question, and it is the cyber security as we come up to Christmas and we look at how vulnerable our businesses are. And I was just wondering, is there any special help that the department may be able to offer to those businesses that find themselves most at risk?
Well, that kind of strays this type of initiative into the criminal justice type initiative, and we do work quite closely with both the PSNI and the Department of Justice to make sure that there is an awareness, a general level of awareness out there in relation to cybersecurity matters. And the member is correct, there is an increasing sense of vulnerability, and I know, having spoken to police personnel myself, that this is an area of crime that they're increasingly focusing on. So whatever role the Department of Finance and its broad role across all public sector can play, then we're very happy to do that in the future.
Keith Buchanan.
Mr. Speaker, question 2, please.
Cancora, with your permission, I'll answer questions 2 and 11 together. The Council has produced a very comprehensive and informative guide to the public finances in the North. Anything that provides improved transparency to the budget process is to be welcomed. The report has helpfully highlighted specific areas where we can improve and where further budgetary information may be helpful. I and my officials will consider the report further as part of the development of the Executive's 22 to 25 budget, which is to be finalised next year. In regard to the Council's response to the 2021 spending review, I welcome the Council's comments that a multi-year settlement provides an opportunity to implement a 3-year budget here.
Keith Buchanan, supplementary.
Thank you, and thank the Minister for his response so far. Minister, within the report in year 2019 to 20, the UK public sector raised £828 billion, with Northern Ireland contributing 2.4% of this, which is roughly £19.8 billion. 10,500 per person gone out, and roughly 15,900 coming back in. However, we've only 2.8% of the population here. With the block grant from the Treasury and the recent support during the pandemic, is there not a benefit of being part of the world's 5th largest economy?
Well, I'm not surprised that the member focused on that one particular aspect of the report. Of course, there are different ways of counting what the subvention is in relation to here, and the Fiscal Council references the Office for National Statistics estimate of the fiscal deficit. That estimate is based on assumptions around tax revenue rather than actual data. It includes £3.3 billion of non-identifiable spending made up of things like British government debt repayment and military forces. So it's important not to conflate that with the accounting exercise with the economic impacts that there are here in terms of public level of spend. So I'm sure the member can find his own arguments in relation to his own particular political philosophy, though it has seemed to be for many decades now one that if we're good enough, the British government and its generosity might give us more money. I'd rather be able to stand on our own 2 feet and look after our own affairs.
Liz Kimmins.
Good Concord. I thank the Minister for his answer so far. Minister, we're all aware that the British Government has failed to adequately replace the EU funding that we've lost due to Brexit, and in the context of the funding that has been made available, the Fiscal Council has concluded that local accountability and scrutiny could be diluted by the British Government's bypassing of the Executive in allocating these funds. Would the Minister therefore agree that this is yet another example of the British Government's disrespect for the democratic rights of the people who live here, in keeping with the reckless Brexit project which has cost us this funding in the first place?
Well, there's no doubt that our own estimate in terms of the replacement of EU funding will show us in a net loss position. We now have a situation where the British Government's attempt to replace some of that funding is done through their own competition processes, the Levelling Up agenda and the Shared Prosperity Fund. The initial pilot scheme of that delivered us way short of what would have been expected under European funding, and we have no influence or input into that, which means that some of the projects that are funded may well be in line with priorities we have, others may not. We may find ourselves cross-cutting in projects we were preparing to support that find funding elsewhere, so there's no level of coordination at all. It's very unsatisfactory, and that doesn't just apply to us here in this jurisdiction, it also applies in Scotland and Wales, where they have a similar outlook in relation to the British Government's approach.
So despite the authority of the documentation from the Fiscal Council on the issue of the net fiscal balance, which they very clearly articulate as £10.3 billion at page 36, the Minister is still seeking to cling to his debunked, spurious assertion to this House in times past, like in February 20, that the net fiscal balance is only £3 billion. Here you have it on the highest authority, and the Minister still thinks he knows better, or rather his politics know better.
Well, I'm glad that the member is has such allegiance to the highest authority. We'll see how that plays out in the time ahead. But the Office of National Statistics' work is to provide an overview of British Government public finances. That's where they've sought to share out this type of spending on military forces and on debt right across Britain and here. Those expenses aren't incurred here. What I like to operate is on what we actually spend, what public services we get. So it isn't a case of saying that the Fiscal Council have got it wrong at all. It's simply two different ways of looking at the same issue.
Steve Egan.
Thank you very much, Aidan. May I thank the Minister for an answer so far. And indeed, referring to this very good document, which I would encourage everybody to read from cover to cover, the total managed expenditure is somewhere about £30.1 billion. Has the Minister directed any of his officials to do a comparison between the amount of money that's spent per head of the population of Northern Ireland against those in Scotland or England, or indeed the Republic of Ireland, to realise what a great benefit being part of the United Kingdom we're in? And that would be a very useful figure, I would imagine, for all of the members of the Assembly to see.
There appears to be a very marked increased desperation across these benches right around here to try and big up Santa Claus a bit here in relation to the. I mean, there are different ways of counting this. The fact that the population here needs more intervention as a consequence of 50 years of rule of his party, plus another 30 years of direct rule, is perhaps not something that he should be crowing about. The fact that the opposite benches appear to be quite comfortable with the idea of a begging bowl mentality, where some years we might get a good bounce out of it and other years we won't, but that's up to the British Government. I would much prefer that we raise our own finances, we stand on our own 2 feet, and we take our own decisions in the best interest of the entirety of our population that live on this island.
Matthew O'Toole.
Speaker, Minister, those who think that we should forever be eternally grateful for the beneficence of Tory ministers have their own questions to answer. But as for you, the Finance Minister, you've appointed a Fiscal Commission as well as the Fiscal Council. The Fiscal Council's paper says that just £1 in every 20 that we spend here is raised locally. That's very low compared to Scotland and Wales. If the Fiscal Commission comes back with proposals for new revenue-raising powers and for new ways that we can take matters into our own hands, as it were, in this jurisdiction, will you announce those as part of the 3-year budget that I know you're working on at the minute?
No, I think time-wise it won't be possible to do that. I wish that it were. I would sincerely hope that we would have an executive agreement to do that. But the process that would fall, and that's why I said when I set up the Fiscal Commission, given where we are in this mandate, that the report that it will produce early in the new year will fall likely to an incoming executive to discuss and agree. An agreement by an incoming executive would then open up a negotiation process with Treasury in terms of how such powers would be transferred and what the arrangements would be for them. So none of that would be possible within the time frame of setting a budget over the next 12-14 weeks and legislate that between then and the end of the mandate. So I think the problem is that we're long overdue this type of approach and this type of report. Both Wales and Scotland have been through a number of iterations of Fiscal Commission type reports, and we are at last getting to somewhere where that is now being looked at. But I would hope that an incoming executive would look at it very favourably and begin that exercise of looking at additional powers we can raise our own finances for the purposes of assisting us in directing where our priorities are.
Paul Stephen Dunn.
3, Mr. Speaker.
In order to provide support as quickly as possible, and rather than waiting until the January monitoring, I wrote to the Executive colleagues on the 17th of November proposing that the full £14 million Barnett consequential is immediately provided to the Department for Communities for an energy payment support scheme to alleviate fuel poverty this winter. It's clear that the £14 million will not go far enough in terms of providing for this much-needed support. Therefore, I asked all ministers to carefully examine their departmental budgets to see if they would be in a position to identify underspends in advance of January monitoring to maximise the support that can be provided to households. I have shared proposals with Executive colleagues and hope to get an agreement as soon as possible on the level of that funding that can be provided to the Department of Communities for this vital support measure.
Supplementary, Stephen Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Minister for his answer. Does the Minister recognise the unacceptable delay that 4 months into the autumn and winter period, with households and businesses really struggling with energy bills this month, including many working families, the need for a dedicated financial support scheme and a real timeline for delivery?
Well, I do recognise that the problems that he's outlining. I also recognise that the energy prices went up very suddenly only about a month, 6 weeks ago. And the Department of Communities last year did provide a support package worth about £50 million. So clearly the £14 million that's come across as a Barnett consequential wouldn't be enough, given the increase and the growing crisis in terms of cost of living. And that's why I asked departments to bring forward, rather than wait to January monitoring, to bring forward amounts that they were preparing to surrender, so the Executive could have an idea of what may be in the pot, and to take an initiative early on in terms of providing sufficient funding for this scheme. So I'm hoping that we can get agreement to move on that very quickly.
Call Ciara Ferguson.
Minister, it's good to hear that you're acting in advance of the January monitoring round to propose an increased allocation to the Department for Communities for fuel support payment, which would be fantastic. Given the impact of the rising costs on the NI water, would you also consider an early allocation to them as well?
Yes, well, the NI Water, I think, is our biggest energy consumer in the public sector body. So, and it has been identified that there are particular challenges given the increase in cost of electricity. So, as part of that package that I did, proposition I did put to the Executive, I also included an amount for NI Water to try and tie them over in terms of the increases they're facing, at least until January.
I call Mark Durgan.
I thank the Minister for his answers thus far. Again, welcome the news that this cross-departmental work is going on in an attempt to alleviate the worst of the poverty that people are encountering this winter. There's plenty of questions I could ask. There's plenty of questions people will ask. What I would say is the design of this scheme dependent on those contributions from other departments, and has the Minister or any Minister explored the possibility of extracting contributions from utility companies themselves towards this as well?
Well, I'm not sure that we have the authority to extract contributions from utility companies. I'd say that would be a reserved matter. Would that we did have that power, we might perhaps be talking to them. But we did get responses from departments to indicate what monies they would be surrendering, so I was able to put together a proposition which I think would be sufficient. It will never ever be enough, because people are living in a level of crisis and energy prices are going through the roof, but it will be an important support package nonetheless. So I am hoping for an early resolution in relation to that issue, and be able to get the Department of Communities up and running with a scheme that will help much needed households.
Paul McNesbitt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the Economy Minister is bizarrely handing back 41 million, despite the fact travel agents are on their knees and the stay-at-home scheme, holiday scheme has been cancelled, can the Minister think of a better way to reallocate the money than through an emergency fuel poverty scheme?
Well, I think we're all aware that that is one of the most pressing needs that families are facing at the current time, and that's why, rather than wait to January to see what the returns might be, I asked departments early to give an early indication so we could put together a package early to support winter fuel payments, and that's what I have put to the Executive. As I say, there is an element in that to support NIW, because they have particularly pressing issues with energy costs, but it is largely to support that, and I would hope that we can get an Executive agreement on that and get it into action as quickly as possible.
William Humphrey.
Speaker, question number 4.
The legal advice on the full impact of the interaction of Article 39A 1A of the Rates Order and the coronavirus restrictions was received in a number of stages between March 2020 and June 2021. There are 6 key pieces of advice that confirm the impact. My department received the first pieces of legal advice that there may be an impact on the 25th and 26th of March 2020. At that point, the advice was that any change to net annual values would be temporary, lasting only as long as the restrictions. On the 10th of May 2020, this advice was reversed, and we were advised that the changes would be permanent and last for the entire duration of the valuation list. On the 12th of August, legal advice from a second senior counsel was received that even if the restrictions did constitute relevant matters under Article 39A, there may be no change to the NAV justified in the specific circumstances of the property. Therefore, each would have to be assessed individually. On the 28th of September, advice was received that any change made to an NIV on the basis of Article 39A matters would have to be applied to comparable properties. This was the first confirmation that the impact of a single challenge would be wider than the individual property and could have widespread impact on what is known as the tone of the list. This was confirmed by another senior counsel on the 19th of December 2020. On the 21st of May this year, advice was received that the very generous package of rate reliefs and grants for businesses that had been provided by the Executive during the pandemic were not relevant to determining the NAVs. This was important for determining the possible financial impact. And finally, on June the 12th this year, advice was received that social distancing and other COVID control measures would have to be taken into account in the assessment of an NAV. This very substantially increased the range of factors that LPS valuers were obliged to consider, and by extension, the estimated financial impact of the issue.
William Humphrey, supplementary.
The Minister for that very detailed answer. Could I ask the Minister, given that he's mentioned impact on a number of occasions, what would be the impact and the ramifications for Northern Ireland Business plc from what he's just set out?
Well, the impact on the Executive's budget is potentially into the hundreds of millions of pounds over a number of years. The core of this issue, as I explained during the discussion at the second stage on the bill when we sought accelerated passage, and the committee have undertaken, I thank them for the work they've already begun in raising this bill. The core of this issue was that the Executive used the resources it had through the COVID-19 money to compensate businesses for being closed. The purpose of this legislation in its original intent was to compensate for a specific local issue, like I referenced the Primark fire and the businesses that were obliged to close around it. The effect of using that procedure to claim compensation for coronavirus would be that people would in effect be compensated twice. and so we had to move to try and close down that effect in relation, specifically only in relation to coronavirus. Not people can appeal on a range of other measures, and that will continue to be the case. So there was a need to close this down because the potential cost in terms of the executive and public finances was so significant.
Melissa McHugh.
Agad Concorla agus Boilum just Buasi and Foster Listener for Hanya the Ratches Kujisha. I'm sure that for all members within this House that there hasn't been a week or a day that has gone past when you haven't been in contact with the Land and Property Services. So Minister, will you join with me in acknowledging just the incredible job that Land and Property Services has done since the pandemic, given that their role has been very different from that of collecting monies, but in this case providing support to business throughout the country.
Well, I would agree with the member, of course, but not only have Land and Property Service repurposed themselves to become a grant-given organisation, but other unforeseen consequences, such as the issues which arise in relation to this particular piece of legislation that arose from the pandemic, issues which coincidentally arise in England and Scotland and Wales are being dealt with in a similar fashion in England and Scotland and Wales, very similar to how we're approaching it here, have arisen. So there were an awful lot of challenges thrown up by the pandemic for LPS, who have handled it very well, but also for right across the government sector.
Steve Aiken.
Thank you very much, and thank the Minister for his remarks so far. Minister, just to clarify, previously you've told us that it was £250 million. You've just said to us now it's hundreds of millions of pounds, and you also said it over a particular period of time, which you haven't given the detail of that. Could you furnish those details to this Assembly of the exact workings out of the figures as you have them at the present moment in time, and the length of time that's due to be? Because previously briefings we've been given have been fairly definitive that it was £250 million. It seems to have shifted.
Well, it hasn't. It's my fault if the member thinks there's a vagueness. I hadn't got the figure in front of me, and so my partial recollection, I knew it was in the region that I was loath to give an actual figure because I knew I'd end up coming back to correct that again. But I have no reason to alter from the position that has officially been given to him or indeed to his committee. That's the amount and that's the time frame attached to it.
Mr Speaker, there are significant Barnett consequences likely to arise from the similar bill passing through Westminster. Has the Minister given consideration how that would be allocated in terms of reliefs in the next financial year?
Yeah, as a consequence of that, we would get about £50 million. One of the issues we have is that it's likely to come in this financial year with the insistence that it be spent then, which isn't of particular use because, as you will know, people are still enjoying a rates holiday at the moment. But we are working on a way to try and ensure that can be used in the next financial year. Of course, it's a matter for the Executive to agree, but my proposition to them was that it is ring-fenced and used for a position of rate relief in some measure in the next financial year.
Question number 5, please.
My department established a fund to help private residents in buildings over 18 metres in height who would otherwise have an obligation to meet the cost of removing unsafe aluminium composite material SEM cladding from their homes. An application under the fund was received by the closing date of the 31st of October 2021 from a management company acting on behalf of the residents in one building. The application is currently being assessed.
Supplementary, Doug Beattie.
I thank the Minister. Could you outline, is that the only application, and therefore, if it's the only application, how much is that likely to be for? And are we saying that the fund isn't really picking up and being used at the minute?
Well, we don't have the same type of landscape in terms of buildings as they do in Britain. We have much less high rises here. Unfortunately, I suppose, particularly for people who live in such buildings, there was only one building that was able to qualify under the criteria in terms of SEM. We did, as part of that, actually, look at a range of other non-SEM cladding which might be considered to be unsafe, and I think we have about 11 buildings have come in for that, and that will take another programme. But my estimation, and obviously that application has been assessed and it will have to be agreed in terms of the costs, and that contract will have to be put out, and the remedial works to be done, but I'm told it's in the region of £400,000. So that would mean more than half of that £1 million is yet to be used. But we are looking, as I say, as a consequence of the other feedback we've got in relation to other buildings, to see what programmes are needed in the future.
Carol Killen.
Good Controller, and thank the Minister for his answer to Doug Beattie. My question is in a similar vein. I mean, we all remember the tragic events at Grenfell in 2017, and I welcome this £1 million fund to remove unsafe cladding. When do you expect, Minister, the work to begin on the Victoria Place in South Belfast, and in relation to the 11 other buildings and perhaps a new fund coming on board? I'll write to you about those, because you'll be aware I have high-rise towers in my own constituency as well. Thank you.
Well, the expectation is that if that particular property meets all of the criteria, a funding agreement will be entered into with the applicant before the start of January next year. Once that's secured, then it's obviously up to the managing agent to enter into a contract to undertake the works, and the managing agent has indicated the works are likely to take approximately 6 months to complete. In relation to the other 11 buildings, and I'm sure I will hear from her to have some indication of the properties in her own constituency, we are in discussion with the Department of Communities and the Housing Executive about how that might be taken forward, so we're hoping to make progress on that in the near future.
Just McNulty.
Thank you, Minister, to you and your my colleague, Ms Kimmins, for joining with me and welcoming my guest, John Dalzell, to the Great Hall today at the Stormont to launch his 30th annual Christmas sit-out. It was a wonderful launch, and let's be very generous in our support for him. Minister, can you confirm how many people in the north are still living in homes with unsafe aluminium composite material cladding, and why 4 years after Grenfell fire has more progress not been made on their removal to date?
Well, as I said in outline to my original answers, we have identified one property, and that's the only one that has ACM above 18 metres and is deemed to require these works. There is no particular department here that has responsibility for this. In Britain, there is a Department of Housing and Local Communities which had an entire responsibility for all the matters that come in under question here. The Department of Finance, in the absence of any other department stepping up, once again stepped up and took on the responsibility for dealing with this at the request of the head of the civil service, and so we have rolled out this particular programme, and as a consequence we have one piece of property that qualifies in relation to that, and as I say, we expect there will be agreement to fund it by the end of the year, and that once the contracts are awarded, that work will take 6 months to complete.
I call Paula Bradshaw. A member may not have time for a supplementary.
Question 6, please.
As you'll be aware, I've recommended to the Executive that funding for health service should be its top priority in this budget. A multi-year budget provides all departments, as well as the Department of Health, with greater certainty of their funding over the next 3 years, and provides an opportunity for longer-term planning. I have shared a paper with Executive colleagues which sets out indicative allocations to the departments in the draft budget. This contained recommendations to provide additional funding to the Department of Health to support the transformation of health and social care. This was discussed at the Executive meetings on the 23rd of November and the 2nd of December. It's ultimately for the Executive to agree any recommendations to allocate resources accordingly. I hope the Executive will agree a draft budget and be in a position to commence consultation on it in the very near future.
A very quick supplementary.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And Minister, thank you for the response. I spoke to you before question time about the back pay and pay increases for agency staff working in the civil service. Can you let me know when they're going to get that payment? Thank you.
Well, I'd be very happy to hear from the member in writing, just to make sure we're clear in which agencies that you're talking about. And I, of course, want to see all people who are providing work for the public sector adequately rewarded for that work, and that's why I've introduced the Living Wage Foundation issue into civil service and to public bodies generally. So if I hear from her, I'm very happy to come back to her in more detail in relation to that.
Sorry, that ends the period for list of questions. We now move on to 15 minutes of topical questions. I call Harry Harvey.
Speaker, thank you, Minister, for your answers thus far. Minister, many of my constituents are having difficulty reaching government departments by telephone due to remote working. Just wondering what steps has your department taken to address these problems?
We do have a responsibility for NI Direct, which is generally the first point of contact for people trying to access public services. I'm not aware that there are any particular problems in relation to that, but I'm very happy if he has some specifics to send them on to me in the department, and I'll ensure that they are taken up with NI Direct.
Supplementary, Harry Harvey.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister, for your answers. Minister, elderly constituents are also finding particularly hard to access this system, so I take it your department will look into that for me also. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, some of the issues that I know have been kind of commented on lately in relation to difficulty access, things like the COVID cert and other issues and issues around the High Street voucher were actually run by other departments. But NI Direct does provide that point of contact function for a lot of the issues that are being dealt with locally. So I'm very happy if there are specific issues. I know when a lot of things are online, that makes it particularly difficult for people who are older and people who are living in rural areas where broadband coverage isn't as good. So I think we have to be cognizant of that and make sure that where people do want to contact and get information services, we do our very best to provide that for them.
I call Robbie Butler.
And on the same subject, Minister, what proportion of civil servants are indeed still working from home, if you're aware?
Well, the advice is to work from home unless you can't do that. So I'm not sure that we have this precise figure of that, but we asked people to follow the advice. We had entered into a period where we were preparing to return to work. The health advice then in the last number of weeks was to go back to the work from home where possible message. So I assume that probably has reduced down again the number of people that were coming into departments. But as soon as that advice changes, we are working on the issue of looking at workforce arrangements into the future. And I think we won't return to the type of workforce and the type of behaviour we had. And for those of us who travel in and out of Belfast every day, it's probably not a bad thing if there is more blended working. But I do think that we will move to a new way, a new mode of working, but we're not at that point yet. But I can ask if there are specific figures which show how many people are in and out. But from my experience, it tends to vary depending on when the people need to be in for specific issues. It's not, you're all needed in the building and you're all not. It's people coming in. I know in my own case, in my own department, people come in for specific issues, and then you may not see them again for another couple of weeks other than on Zoom or whatever. So.
Robbie Butler, supplementary.
Thank the Minister for his answer. In terms of the development then of what may be post-COVID in terms of those working arrangements, would it be part of the assessment to look at the productivity that has been achieved with working from home balanced against that family-friendly and well-being approach? Would that be fair enough?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of lessons that will be learned from this, and I'm keen that they are taken up. We are in a general process of reform within the civil service, some of which has emerged from RHI, and other issues in terms of the audit committee and things that they have raised, or the PSE, and issues that have been raised in audit office reports. So there's a general sense of looking at, of course, the pandemic has come in and has accelerated probably what would have been a growing pattern of having a more flexible working arrangement, and that clearly is very beneficial for people who have young families. Early senses I was getting of that the productivity had actually improved onto that, but I think we need an assessment now right over the full range of the last 18 months and into hopefully when we emerge fully from restrictions and get a sense of how that works. But I know certainly in terms of any surveys that it's very popular that people can have that flexibility to be able to work from home when they need and to come into the office whenever they need as well.
I call Stephen Dunn.
Mr. Speaker, earlier on in question time I spoke of the crippling impact that rising energy bills are having on local businesses. Another current challenge to local business is the COVID vaccine passport scheme. Does the Minister recognise the difficulties this scheme is having on many businesses, particularly our hospitality sector, many of whom have very limited staff and resources?
Well, I do know that staffing is a challenge for hospitality. It's a challenge for every sector we have. I've been out and engaging with manufacturing, with hospitality, with retail, and everywhere I go, staffing is a challenge. It just seems to be many more jobs available than there are people to take them up. In the one sense, that's good, because if we can get the right skills to people and get people into work, we have a high level of economic inactivity. But in relation to, my experience of the outworking of the COVID cert, and certainly what I've heard from in south of the border, and I've been down in various premises there as well, is that it works smoothly enough. I've heard business people say it hasn't presented a significant challenge to them. I do get where venues are smaller, staffing may be an issue, but you're literally talking if people are ready for it. You're talking about 2 seconds of showing COVID cert, and contact tracing comes off that as well. So we have a responsibility to try and assist businesses as much as we can in terms of advice and guidance and support when they have to adhere to restrictions that are brought in. So I hope that the task force that the Executive runs will continue to engage with business to make sure that they can continue to operate the scheme as long as it's necessary.
Stephen Dunn, supplementary.
Mr Speaker, and thank the Minister for his answer. But would he share the concerns of the hospitality sector about the safety of, for example, lone workers in small licensed premises being asked to enforce these COVID certifications when face covering enforcement is not in place in other settings such as public transport?
Well, I think the question of enforcement is one which is always a challenge, and we're not asking people to go and put themselves in any danger to do that. If there are issues which arise which move this on to a more criminal issue, then the PSNI are available to be called to such issues. So I haven't had any reports as yet of incidents like that. As I say, the Executive Task Force needs to continue to give advice and guidance and support to people who are asked to operate restrictions as are brought in on the advice of our medical advisors to the Executive. These things are only brought in when they're absolutely necessary, and they're only brought in for as long as they're necessary. There's none of us want to be in a position where restrictions apply and we want to get out of them as quickly as we reasonably can. But the variants are changing in terms of the virus, and the threat and the level of concern is still there. So we have to act in a responsible way. And we would hope that customers who are considering going out to these places also act in a responsible way. So the onus isn't put on just those who work in such venues to ensure that the restrictions are complied with.
Keith Archibald.
And I thank the Minister for his responses so far. Minister, you've said, excuse me, you've said on many occasions that you believe health needs to be prioritised in the upcoming budget, and obviously that's something that we would all welcome. The need for long-term structural reform in the health system and the additional funding that will be required to carry out those reforms is something that's been well rehearsed in this chamber over many debates. We now have a multi-year budget for the next 3 years, so how will that allow us to better plan for the future and to implement those reforms?
Well, I mean, we've had this debate regularly for the last 18 months, 2 years here, almost 2 years, of the prioritisation in relation to health, of the fact that we wanted multi-year budgets to allow us to actually put in place the reforms that had been brought forward in various reports that we've never had the opportunity to action. And that's why I've proposed to the Executive a significant uplift for health, specifically targeted about meeting some of those reform areas, because as well as needing to look after the health of our population, we also recognise that health is continuing to consume a higher and higher level of public finances. And if we don't take action now in the time ahead, then the next Executive in 3 years' time, which comes to set the next budget, is faced with an even greater challenge. So I think there is an imperative for the health of the population, the experience of the pandemic, the people who work in the health services as well, to give them the support they need, but also for our public finances to address these issues over the next 3 years.
Keith Archibald, supplementary.
And I thank the Minister for that response, and I suppose that's very welcome that there will be the uplift in the forthcoming budget. But does the Minister also agree that those structural reforms are needed in the health and social care system to allow us to ensure that other key public services also receive the resourcing and the finance that they need?
Yes, it clearly is a case that it's a balance. None of our public services have the resources they need, and it's been evident for many years. And this 3-year budget, while welcome in terms of the ability to plan, doesn't give us anywhere approaching the level of resource we need to deliver the type of public services we want. So when we decide to prioritise one, that has a negative impact on a range of other public services. And that is going to be a challenge in the time ahead. I think people need to understand that as part of the budget process. If we're going to focus on a number of key areas, with health being probably the primary one, then that will have an implication for right across the range of public services. And that's something that we have to manage on the basis that we don't have all that we want to do, all that we need.
Well, Deborah Erskine.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Minister will be aware that my constituency is one of the most westerny constituencies in the UK. It's a wonderful place to live, but however, civil servants are travelling long distances to get to work. Would the Minister detail what stage his plans are for implementing the civil service hubs and how advanced discussions are with council areas?
Well, she's quite right in terms of the distance and the beauty of Fermanagh as well. I concur with her on that. And Enniskillen has been chosen as one of the 10 locations to roll out the first phase of the civil service hubs, and that does recognise that people travel very long distances to come in and out of Belfast to work. And in this age of rapidly advancing technology, and particularly with the pandemic, I suppose, accelerating that, the need for people to come and be sitting in an office desk all of the time has changed, and we need to recognise that. I think what it also does is when we do locate there, and it's based on the number of civil service who are travelling up and down from Fermanagh generally, but it also opens up more opportunities for people who are perhaps not yet applying for civil service, because I'm sure she will know people in her own constituency that wouldn't necessarily apply for a job in Belfast because of the travel involved. I think if they have the opportunity for 2 or 3 days a week to be based in Enniskillen, then that may increase the interest in people from across Fermanagh and other border areas generally to apply for jobs within the civil service, which is all to the good. It changes the dynamic, introduces more rural and border dwellers, which is a good thing. So we are working very closely with the Council. I'm not sure on the exact progress and specifically in relation to Enniskillen, but I'm happy to respond to her in relation to that. But we want to get these schemes up and running very, very quickly. A number of them are in a more ready state than others, but I'm very happy to respond to her specifically on Enniskillen.
Supplementary.
I want to thank the Minister for his answers there. I mean, Enniskillen, it's important that that has progressed quickly, and could he commit to ensuring that my constituency is given priority, considering the distance that it is for civil servants to travel up to Belfast, because obviously that will help our environment, and it will also provide a better work-life balance for those people working in the civil service from my constituency.
Well, it already has been given that priority, and that it's one of the first 10 to be considered. And I can assure you, when that was announced, there were an awful lot of other towns right across the north who were saying, "What about us?" And rightly so. I think we do want to make jobs more accessible, and we do want to give people that type of work-life balance that allows them to work in their own areas. And then the contribution that makes in those local towns. To have people there and that footfall that will generate locally, to have people staying in the area, and of course the environmental benefits that she alludes to. So yes, we will press ahead as a matter of urgency with all of those. Some of them are, as I say, just because of the particular circumstances, with particular councils being more ready to engage, having readily available buildings to locate these things in. I think that might be a particular issue in Enniskillen, but we will get to the bottom of that, and we will try and get working on it as quickly as we can.
Well, Colm Gildernew.
Minister, the cost of living has spiralled rapidly over the past number of months and continues, in fact, to spiral, causing huge hardship for many families and households. They are facing an unprecedented spike in energy costs, coupled with the shameful Tory decision to cut the £20 universal credit uplift, as well as the ongoing costs associated with Brexit and the pandemic. Therefore, what opportunities are there existing within the upcoming budget to give families a break and mitigate against the rise in the cost of living?
Well, as I said in earlier answer to some of the questions, we're trying to take an initiative now because the cost of energy has risen very substantially, very quickly, and we recognise that throws a lot of homes into a level of crisis for heating over the winter. And so, in collaboration with the Minister for Communities, I've tried to put forward a proposition to the Executive, which I hope will get its endorsement in the very near future. In the longer term, as I've said, we are trying to we have a very limited budget. That even with the 3-year plan, which is welcome, it still is not enough to do what we need to do, and that's going to present a whole series of challenges right across all departments. But I think the Executive have to prioritise, and I would hope that, as well as looking at health, because all of these factors contribute to ill health, people are suffering in poverty, that the Executive will continue to focus on anti-poverty measures as well as health and other issues in the time ahead.
Supplementary, Colm Gildernew.
And thank the Minister for his answer. And given the situation that you've outlined there, Minister, in terms of the financial situation, countries all across Europe have brought in mitigations against rising prices, yet the British Chancellor refuses to agree a cut in VAT for energy bills. Would you agree with me, Minister, that the British Government needs to take action to support families at this time?
Yes, and I've written to the Chancellor asking them to put a zero rate on VAT on energy bills. We haven't had any indication that they intend to follow through on that, but we will continue to press the case with them. Unlike ourselves, they have the resources, if they need to go and find them, to take initiatives in this regard. It's a political choice whether they do or whether they don't. Ours is about dividing up a very insufficient pie and trying to make the best use of that across a range of pressing priorities. So any support from there would obviously be very much welcome.
Time's up, members, and members please take your ease for a moment or two.